In San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, shifting into reverse. As abruptly as he decided to close them, Elon Musk decides to keep many of Tesla's stores open, raising prices on its electric cars to pay for costs. Plus, China and Indonesia have temporarily grounded their fleets of Boeing 737 MAX 8 planes after an Ethiopian Airlines crash, killing all 157 people on board. It is the second fatal disaster for Boeing's best-selling model in 5 months. And NVIDIA will buy data center chipmaker Mellanox for $6.9 billion, outbidding rivals like Intel. How the deal went down and does it mean more consolidation is coming. But first, to our top story. Elon Musk is hitting the brakes on closing the doors at some of Tesla's retail stores. Instead, the car maker will raise average vehicle prices by about 3% and keep some stores open. This comes days after Tesla alarmed analysts by announcing it would wind down most of its brick-and-mortar stores and move to online-only sales. Joining us now, Oppenheimer senior analyst Colin Rush, who currently has an outperform rating on Tesla, and from New York, Bloomberg's Craig Trudell, who covers Tesla for us. So, Craig, the blog post, the company announced this in a blog post, doesn't say anything about the reason why. What do we know about the motivation here?
Well, we know very little. So the company said next to nothing about its rationale, to your point. We do know that this is a decision that caught employees off guard. It caught investors off guard. Analysts were not expecting this whatsoever. With all due respect to Colin, I think the comment of the day on this morning was that this sort of looked like amateur hour on Tesla's part. This was a decision that sort of blindsided everybody, and I think there's a combination of factors that maybe led to this reconsidering. It was going to be difficult for the company to get out of leases for where it has stores. There were all sorts of concerns on the part of customers about not being able to actually, see and touch and feel the cars. And after, all of the ways in which this industry is changing, that still matters to a lot of people.
That comment, Craig, coming from Evercore, which said this is amateur hour, Tesla needs a stronger layer of middle management. Colin, are you happy with this decision?
Honestly, this isn't different than what we were told offline after they made the decision that they were going to go through an evaluation process in all these stores and shut down a certain number of them. So we don't really know what the process was for making this decision, the announcement last week and the week before, and then what got announced this week. And so there's some question around that. But it does point to the concern around management and depth of management and the thoroughness of the decision-making process. And that is always a concern when you see an organization like this that's had such significant turnover at the senior levels over the last couple of years.
Now, Craig, RBC suggested that perhaps Tesla's doing this because it didn't get a positive reaction on orders. Remember, this was on the very same day that Musk announced the $35,000 Model 3. Could it be possible that the online orders that followed just didn't measure up with his expectations?
Yeah, I think that also could have been a real factor here. I'm not sure to what extent Tesla's communicating that. It sounds like they're being cagey with Colin and the rest of the analyst community about what played into this. But it certainly stands to reason that just sort of reading the tea leaves, you're seeing reports as we wrote up last week from Inside EVs, which is a website that does monthly estimating of how many cars Tesla is selling in the U.S. month by month. And they see a real slowdown in the Model 3 and even the Model S sales as well in the first couple months of this year. Some of that's going to be seasonal, where the first couple months of the year are sort of weak for the whole industry. And Tesla also did say that they were going to really focus on deliveries to Europe and China this quarter. So it's not a total surprise, but you have seen some of the analysts raise concerns about weaker sales, and that may be playing into Musk's guidance a couple weeks ago that he doesn't expect to earn a profit this quarter.
Colin, are you concerned about weaker sales?
You know, the heart of this story at the end of the day for us is about depth of demand and margin on those cars. So at what price are they able to sell the volumes that they need to really see significant operating leverage? And so there's a couple of things that we like to highlight. First, Model S and Model X significantly outsold anyone's expectations, especially in the high end. And so we think there's potentially substantially more demand than a lot of folks are looking for in this Model 3 class. You know, as we look against some of the competition, average price kind of $46,000, $47,000 for competitors. And, you know, sales numbers for Audi A4, you know, Mercedes C-Class, BMW 3 in the 400 to 500,000 unit range. They would have to take significant share here. We think that's definitely a possibility. And the depth of overall demand is sufficient to support them, but they would be competing very aggressively with the other car makers in this space. So we think they can get to those numbers. And the real question is how much money are they going to make on those sales? So getting to 350,000, 400,000 Model 3s, we think they need to be in the 20% range on a gross margin basis to really support the earnings leverage here. And we're in the camp of saying that we think that happens, and we start to see the evidence of that as the seasonality comes off here at the end of March into April, and we start to see what the 2Q guide is going to look like.
Meantime, Craig, quickly, we're getting new information about what Tesla employees knew when regarding Elon Musk's take private tweet, including one former employee who's apparently spilled the beans to the SEC, saying employees knew about this internally and questioned whether the plan was legitimate. Give us in a nutshell what happened here.
Yeah, this is a former security manager who's being represented by a New York attorney who's actually represented a few folks who've tried to, who have submitted whistleblower complaints to the SEC. And this ex-manager says that there was knowledge of this idea that Tesla maybe was going to go private, and sort of doubts that that was going to be possible before Elon Musk sent his now infamous funding secured tweet and other posts on August 7th. Tesla, importantly, is pushing back on this. They're saying that this guy was fired after about a year with the company, and that this is untrue. And so this is a report that you have to sort of take with a grain of salt here, just given Tesla's pushback and the way in which this attorney has definitely been aggressive about trying to generate publicity about his attempted whistleblowers.
All right, you'll continue to follow that one for us. Craig Trudell, who covers Tesla for Bloomberg, and Colin Rush of Oppenheimer. Thank you both. Meantime, Alphabet CEO and co-founder Larry Page personally approved a $150 million severance package for Android creator Andy Rubin, while the company helped to cover up his alleged misconduct. This, according to new information revealed in a lawsuit that was filed in January. I want to bring in Bloomberg's Garrett DeVink, who covers Google, for us. So, Garrett, parts of this complaint were redacted and were just revealed today, and this is what we found out. What exactly is new here?
So what's new here is that Larry Page, who is the CEO of Alphabet, obviously founder of Google, he was personally responsible for a $150 million equity grant to Andy Rubin. Now, what we still don't know is whether Larry Page knew about the investigation into Andy Rubin that eventually led to his termination. So he was already under investigation by people at the company, by HR at the company, for sexual harassment. And then during that time, Larry Page made a decision to give him a $150 million stock grant that, when he was eventually fired, sort of was negotiated down to $90 million.
Now, investors in this complaint are also targeting the board, not just Larry Page, but also co-founder Sergey Brin, John Doerr, venture capitalist, longtime member of Google's board. What are the next steps here?
The accusations against the board are that they, were not really involved in a lot of these things that were going on. And so the complaint alleges that Larry gave this equity grant to Andy Rubin without even asking the board. And I mean, $150 million is a ton of money, even for a company like Google. And Google has a history of, giving extremely high compensation to its employees, especially top performers. It believes that that's what's necessary and has led to its success. But then after giving that money to Andy Rubin, Larry Page then went to the board and asked for what this complaint alleges was a rubber stamp approval. So not only do we have a story here about how this company handles sexual harassment from top performers, we also have a few questions about corporate governance and whether the board is involved in the conversations that it should be involved in.
Now, I have a source who told me that the founders of Google believe that Rubin was perhaps never fairly compensated for Android, which was a huge innovation and brought a lot of revenue to the company. Do we know any more about the motivation for a potential, massive payout in the midst of credible misconduct allegations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big question that, that I'm asking people, that I think, we're still trying to find out, even though the story about Andy Rubin and sexual harassment has been out there for a few months, is who knew what and when. Whether this original $150 million payout was given, purely because, like you said, Andy Rubin had a major contribution to the company and its future, or whether, it was given even though the company knew that these allegations were swirling around him. And, the original reporting about this by the New York Times and others said that $150 million allowed Andy Rubin, when he actually, realized he was going to have to leave the company, to negotiate what ended up being a $90 million severance package. So, the allegations here are saying that the company was giving him way too much money to begin with, and that allowed him, when he was fired, to leave with such a large sum.
Right, and he left without any mention of these allegations. And by the way, Google invested in his next company, Playground. We can't forget to mention that. Bloomberg's Garrett DeVink, great reporting from you on this. Thank you so much for that update. Well, the invitations are out. Apple will hold an event on March 25th. The iPhone maker is expected to introduce an original video programming service and a new premium magazine subscription plan. The video service is designed to rival Netflix and Amazon and will couple Apple-developed or funded TV shows and movies with the ability to subscribe to content from providers like Starz. The event will be held in the Steve Jobs Theater at Apple's Cupertino, California headquarters, and we will be there. Coming up, China and Indonesia halt flights of the Boeing 737 MAX jetliner after the second deadly crash in just 5 months. We'll discuss whether lack of pilot training to use new technology on the plane is to blame. This is Bloomberg. Boeing sold the 737 MAX as a fuel-efficient, technologically advanced upgrade to its popular 737, incorporating more automation in the cockpit. But now 2 fatal crashes within 5 months, Lion Air Flight 610 in October off the coast of Indonesia, and now Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302 shortly after takeoff from Addis Ababa, have put the 737's previously sound safety record under the microscope. Joining us now to discuss, we've got Bloomberg's aviation reporter Alan Levin and aviation analyst Anthony Roman. So, Alan, what is the very latest that we know about the cause so far?
Very little about the cause of this accident in Ethiopia. It is interesting, though, that within the last few minutes, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, which certified the plane, essentially indicated it is not planning, at least for the time being, to ground the 737 MAX models. Overnight, China and some other, in Indonesia, did take that action. So at least for the time being, not only do we not know what happened, but there's been no move to ground the plane here in the U.S.
Now, Anthony, you're a pilot. You've trained pilots. And as I understand it, you've flown on 2 of these and you've noticed some anomalies. What particular kind of anomalies did you monitor?
Well, I flew as a passenger in first class out of Addis Ababa on Ethiopian Air. And the first landing we made at another point in Africa, I found it a little unusual that during the landing phase of the flight, just before the aircraft touched down on the runway, pilots normally raised the nose a few degrees to soften the landing. In this particular case, the plane's pitch, its up and down movement, was an oscillation, which is not the normal procedure to follow. And my first thought was perhaps they have an inexperienced first officer and he's being trained on his first passenger flight. On the return flight to Addis Ababa, I experienced the same exact event with a different flight crew. Not unsafe, but certainly not a normal procedure.
Now, Alan, Alan, give us some context here and parallels with what might have happened here to the Lion Air crash that happened 5 months ago. There has been some reporting that Boeing has been working on revised software as a result of that crash. What do you know about that?
Well, there are a number of threads in that accident in Indonesia that might be part of the cause. The plane had maintenance issues for several days prior to the accident, and they were not able to fix the problem. The pilot actions were questioned by the Indonesians in their preliminary report. And then you have this sort of underlying issue of a new Boeing safety system, which was added to the MAX plane, and that it automatically pushes the nose down if it senses the plane's about to enter what's known as an aerodynamic stall. That generally means the nose is pointed too high, so it tries to push the nose down. Now, in this case, there was a malfunction. It was pushing a perfectly good aircraft's nose down for no reason, and the pilots were sort of fighting back. There's an easy way to switch off the motor that pushes the nose down, but they weren't able to do that, and eventually that plane crashed. Now, and the reason it's interesting here is that the plane outside of Addis Ababa did have some unusual descents shortly after takeoff, which is, as I say, very unusual. Now, we don't know if it's related. It's way too early to say. And at least for now, the FAA is not grounding it. So that suggests it's probably not a direct link. But it is something everybody's keeping a very close eye on.
Now, I want to be really careful about speculating here because there's so much that we don't know. But Anthony, given the fact that these planes were equipped with more advanced automation, the concern has been raised that perhaps the pilot and the crew weren't necessarily trained to deal with that kind of technology. And this software update from Boeing has actually taken many months, and we don't know why it has been taking so long. I mean, do you have any concerns about the technology on this plane and the ability of the crew to deal with it?
Well, pilots should always be trained in all of the important systems on an aircraft. They should also be trained to respond to malfunctions in a way that keeps the flight systems safe. In this case, it would have been very simple, in the Lion Air case, very simple, to just switch off the MCAS system. That is all you have to do is flip one switch and the system disconnects and you can regain control of the aircraft. However, Boeing and the FAA, during the design of this particular feature and the installation in this aircraft, felt that it wasn't necessary to either alert the pilots that the system was working in the background and to provide proper training for them in malfunctions. It was simply left to the pilot's own discretion.
Interesting. All right. Well, lots remains to be seen. Of course, Alan, I know you're going to continue to cover this for us. Alan Levin, who covers aviation for Bloomberg, and aviation analyst Anthony Roman. Coming up, cashing in. NVIDIA makes a big move to bolster its move into data centers. What its purchase of Mellanox means for the chip sector. This is Bloomberg. NVIDIA has agreed to buy chipmaker Mellanox in its largest purchase ever. The deal for the Israeli manufacturer is worth just under $7 billion. And despite the size of the deal, it will rank in the top 4 semiconductor deals of all time. The move is expected to help NVIDIA push into a growing market for data center components and meet the need for greater processing power across networks. To discuss, we've got Bloomberg Tech's Ian King, who, of course, covers chips for us, and in New York, Bloomberg managing editor for U.S. Deals, Elizabeth Fournier. So, Ian, what's the motivation for this big buy here?
Yeah, I mean, to hear it from NVIDIA, data centers in the future are going to be not just a group of computers, they're going to be all one big computer, basically. So the interconnects between all those individual components become more important.
And you spoke to the CEO last night.
That's right, and that's where Mellanox comes in, because they do the interconnects, and that's why it's important for NVIDIA to get hold of this.
Now, Elizabeth, how does this fit into broader movement we're seeing in the chip sector? There was a big wave of consolidation in the industry, which seemed to have stalled up to this point.
That's right. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, semiconductors were the kind of hottest name in M&A. There was a huge amount of consolidation, a lot of it led by that sort of Avago Broadcom push. And, you know, companies tried to do similar things last year. I'm sure you remember Broadcom Qualcomm and then the NXP deal that fell apart. And what's happened is, you know, people have tried to do big deals and they've really been pushed back by regulatory concerns. So what we see now is a shift to some of these smaller deals, which, as you said, this is a big number, but it doesn't rank in that top 5 deals.
Ian, is this deal going to be subject to regulatory scrutiny?
Well, if you looked at what happened with the share price today, Mellanox was up, but it didn't go up to the offer price. That's a sign that people are concerned that particularly in China, it's going to face that kind of regulatory scrutiny, which could take a while.
So, Elizabeth, in terms of what else could be in the pipeline, would you say we should be looking for deals, but smaller deals?
I think so. I mean, we know that this was a competitive process, that there were other bidders around this till the end. So we can assume that they're still looking for similar bolt-on things that they do. And, you know, Ian's the expert in this area, but we know that there is a lot of the sort of $1 to $5 billion companies out there that are potential targets.
Ian, you hear everything in the chip sector. I mean, what kind of chatter are you hearing about what could be coming next?
Well, I mean, the logic hasn't changed, right? There are still a number of companies out there that just frankly aren't big enough. The costs have gone up. They're okay, they're doing all right, they're reasonably profitable, but they're just really not big enough to stay competitive long term. One analyst note today said Cray Computer are in a similar kind of business. Maybe they're the next one to become a target here. But there are a lot of companies that are arguably subscale.
And NVIDIA beat out Intel. What does that signify?
That signifies that they wanted it more than Intel did. It wasn't just Intel, according to some of our reporting. There was, you know, a number of other companies were interested, and that may have prompted this deal to be announced when it was, you know, regardless of whether it's going to be, you know, an easy process in approval or not.
So, Elizabeth, what else could be in the pipeline that you are watching?
Well, in terms of tech, the big thing we've got our eye on is obviously IPOs, and a lot of those can go down the M&A route. But I think in semiconductors, as Ian said there and you talked about, Intel was the name that lost out here. Maybe we look for them to do something different as an alternative.
All right, Elizabeth Fournier and Ian King for Bloomberg, thank you so much for bringing us your reporting on this. Coming up, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren continues targeting big tech, why she thinks breaking up U.S. tech giants could sustain competition. That is next. This is Bloomberg. Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. Democratic presidential hopeful Senator Elizabeth Warren is going after big tech. After laying out her proposal to break up big tech on Medium last week, Warren took her arguments to the annual South by Southwest Festival in Austin, Texas. She made the argument to an audience of many tech entrepreneurs that breaking up companies like Amazon and Google would keep the marketplace competitive. Take a listen.
That opportunity to do what you do best, to come up with a great idea, to work your heart out to make it happen, to be able to compete on a level playing field is taken away by these platform giants. So my view is break those things apart and we will have a much more competitive, robust market in America.
Joining us to discuss, we've got Bloomberg's executive tech editor, Tom Giles, and on the phone from Dallas, Bloomberg's Susan Warren, who's been covering the parade of Democratic presidential hopefuls at South by Southwest. No relation to the senator, Susan, I should point out. What was the reaction to Senator Warren's remarks on the ground there?
Well, this was a very youthful, techie crowd, and honestly, they just loved her. She was very comfortable speaking to them. She made the pitch about why it's worthwhile to them and their future careers to see more opportunity and more diversity in the marketplace. And she was easily the most popular. She got the most popular response from the crowds over the course of the whole weekend.
Interesting, because didn't the moderator ask the folks who work in big tech to stand up and pointed out that these are the people who would lose out as a result of her proposal, and she just said, boo-hoo?
Well, she said boo-hoo about the companies making more profit. It wasn't that she was not sympathetic with potential unemployment. In fact, she thought it was expanding the employment opportunities. That was her pitch to this crowd. I talked to one young man in the crowd who had just graduated from Berkeley and was going to work for Google. He wasn't so sure about the breakup proposition, but he was all on board with the idea of more scrutiny, more regulation, especially when it comes to private data.
Interesting. So, Tom, walk us through how Warren's plan would work. Because if you read the fine print, a lot of what she's saying could make some sense.
Yeah, she put a lot of thought and time into this. There's a couple different prongs. One of them very, straightforward: break up big tech, break up some of these mergers. For example, Facebook bought WhatsApp, Facebook bought Instagram. She talked about Amazon and Zappos. So she's got a list of deals that she would take a closer look at, and she's invoking AT&T back in the 1980s and some of the big trust-busting cases in U.S. history. But there's also a more nuanced argument, and that's where when these companies start to operate like a platform, like a utility, and they're also competing as part of that platform or with those platform participants, that's where she also is looking for some kind of way to separate out those businesses. So, for example, Amazon. Amazon is a case that she keeps coming back to time and time again. That's a case where Amazon has created this huge marketplace for millions of sellers to go and peddle their wares, but Amazon is also a competitor in there. And she cited actually a story.
Right, Amazon is selling its own batteries,
That's
selling
right.
its own baby wipes.
White labels, exactly. And I just noticed that she cited our colleague Spencer Soper, a story that he wrote about a couple of years ago, where once Amazon sees that your product is starting to gain traction on its platform, it's gaining, popularity, Amazon has a way of creating its own white label version of that and creates this competitive atmosphere for its marketplace participants.
Now, on stage, she talked about Amazon, Facebook, Google, and in an interview with The Verge, she added Apple to this category, and she said, Apple, you've got to break it apart from their app store. It's got to be one or the other. Either they run the platform or they play in the store. They don't get to do both at the same time, so it's the same notion.
And you could imagine, there's got to be an interim step where, maybe these proposals start to gain traction. And maybe instead of actually a full breakup, you see a company like Apple potentially maybe getting out of some of the businesses where it is allegedly competing with App Store participants. That could be an interim step. Another interim step, for example, would be, paying closer attention to the ways that Facebook, for example, operates and spreads information, and maybe forcing them to be a bit more transparent about who is funding a particular advertisement, who is behind a particular piece of information that's being circulated around Facebook. People have talked about kind of treating Facebook and Google, for example, more like traditional media companies. So there are interim steps.
Meantime, Senator Amy Klobuchar, who's also running for, or announced she's running for president, said she wanted to see an investigation to see if breaking up tech companies is the best option. Susan, how were the other candidates received at South by Southwest by this tech-savvy crowd?
I think everyone was, all the candidates that I heard speak were very interested in seeing more regulation over the tech companies. None of them went as far as Elizabeth Warren in proposing a breakup, but they were open to just studying this question, looking at what needed to be done, closer scrutiny of the mergers, maybe even a little bit of retrospective regulation of mergers was proposed, and just overall solving this problem that nobody anticipated having 30 years ago.
Tom, have we heard a reaction from any of these tech companies so far on this?
They're not saying a lot.
We know they're lobbying in Washington.
They have good reason to lay low on this one. Look, the fact that these proposals have come out this early in the campaign shows that this issue is not going away, and she's gaining traction with this. And it does it does resonate with some of her base. So the tech industry is going to have to come up with some kind of a response.
All right, we'll be waiting for that. Tom Giles, our tech executive editor, and Susan Warren for us on the phone there. Thank you so much. Russian internet trolls, meantime, are shifting their strategy ahead of the U.S. elections in 2020. Instead of creating their own propaganda, cybersecurity experts are saying the trolls are using fake accounts to build enormous followings and then promote divisive content, even hacking into devices to create new social media accounts that look legitimate. Joining us to discuss, Bloomberg's Aliza Sabinius. Aliza, explain what the trolls are doing now.
Internet trolls appear to be shifting their tactics ahead of the presidential election. What experts are seeing is that they've shifted their focus to amplify existing content on the platforms rather than create new propaganda. The Russian Internet Research Agency appears to be among those that are implementing the strategy in order to circumvent the protections that Twitter and Facebook, as well as Instagram, put into place after Russia meddled in the 2016 election.
Now, is this something that the federal government is focused on? Are they, looking at this closely enough to be able to potentially stop this from taking off like it did in the last election?
The Federal Bureau of Investigation has focused on preventing foreign influence campaigns. They have a task force. Speaking in San Francisco last week, the director of the FBI said that they're sharing information with social media companies. However, he also said that these kinds of campaigns are ongoing and intensify during election years.
And what are the companies saying about this? I mean, we know that Facebook and Twitter have talked about the resources that they're adding to these efforts. Facebook specifically hiring thousands and thousands of people. But what is the company's position on how they're going to stop this?
Well, it's a slippery problem. So speaking at the same conference last week that the director of the FBI spoke at, the head of cybersecurity at Facebook said that while they want to reduce the kind of bad conversation that you see on these platforms, it's difficult to do so without stifling the good, healthy conversation. So they seem to be grappling with this issue.
All right, Bloomberg's Aliza Sabinius, thank you so much for that report, something that, of course, we will continue to follow. Coming up, Mark Zuckerberg has made a privacy promise, but can he deliver? Our next guest says it is all about the execution, and it might be harder for Facebook to pull off than he thinks. That is next. And later, NASA wants to return astronauts back to the moon, but it will need the private sector to get there. We will discuss the role of startups in the agency's Moon to Mars program next. This is Bloomberg. AT&T is diving deeper into esports, the company backing a new amateur mobile gaming tournament. AT&T will be the founding sponsor of the ESL Mobile Open, which kicks off its first season next week. Esports contestants play video games in front of live and online audiences. Other big-name sponsors include Intel, Coca-Cola, and Mercedes-Benz. Well, Facebook has won itself another bull. Nomura upgraded its view on the stock to buy from neutral, saying that users are transitioning to the social network's Stories feature faster than it had anticipated. The firm also raised its price target to $215 from $172. The move comes after CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced a new initiative focusing on private and encrypted communication for all Facebook-owned platforms. Here to discuss, Jenny Gebhardt of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, also with us, Jitendra Rawal of Bloomberg Intelligence. And I should say, Jenny, that you focusing on messaging specifically at EFF. So when Mark Zuckerberg announced this, what was your first thought?
My first thought was that it is great to see Facebook embracing these kind of privacy and security fundamentals. And it's great to announce a plan like that, but implementing a plan like that is another thing entirely.
How so?
Secure messaging is really hard to get right, both at the technical level and at the policy level. So there's all sorts of places in Mark Zuckerberg's very long announcement, very detailed announcement, where the company could fall into a lot of different traps that could go very wrong for users.
What kind of traps?
So a few that really stand out in particular, the announcement focuses a lot on ephemeral messaging. That means your message isn't going to stick around indefinitely.
Just like Snapchat.
Exactly. Snapchat features are really where the action is, and the company knows that. But ephemeral can mean a lot of different things. You know, how quickly does it disappear? Does it disappear only on your device? Is it wiped from Facebook's servers? There's a lot of questions that need to be answered to manage user expectations around a really important security and privacy feature.
Now, Jitendra, Nomura likes what it's seeing in general, but what do these changes, and we don't know exactly how they're going to be implemented, as Jenny points out, what do they mean for Facebook's bottom line?
So one underlying implication over here is they could bring together over 1.5 billion on WhatsApp people, and then you have Messenger coming to Instagram. So that could help Instagram's growth story. It could also, because stories sort of flows through different platforms across Facebook. So you could see an increased ad inventory as well. So what it sets them up for 2020, if you look at the expectations, the revenue growth is expected to be about 21%. That's largely in line with what the mobile advertising growth is expected to be.
But
so if they can gain market share,
less data to target ads based on?
Yeah, so it's actually a dance of price and volume. The data targeting ability in the end is going to be a relative strength, not an absolute strength. And on a relative basis, Facebook will still be leading. But this year is risky because this transition could come at a lower price point for the ads that they're going with stories. But what it does set them up for is market share gains in 2020. If they do so, then they'll beat expectations.
Meantime, Jenny, part of this is in preparation for Zuckerberg's plan to merge the messaging infrastructure behind Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and Instagram, which you call What's to Messenger, which sounds very foreboding. As that proceeds, what are some mistakes that Facebook could easily make here?
Sure, yes, the impending apocalypse of What's to Messenger. I think two big mistakes that loom large in my mind that I'm looking out for are exactly how encryption is presented to users and whether or not backups are encrypted. So right now, Facebook Messenger has an end-to-end encrypted option, but it's not on by default, it's optional, it's called secret messaging, and so that can be really confusing to users, it's unclear what they're using, and defaults are king, so it's unclear whether a lot of users are even going to take advantage of that end-to-end encryption.
And what about WhatsApp? Those messages are encrypted supposedly end-to-end. Yes. Can we trust that?
Yeah, so WhatsApp messages are encrypted end-to-end, best-in-breed end-to-end encryption, but a big chink in the armor there is an existing feature called automatic backups. You might get a question when you first create WhatsApp, or every once in a while pinging you, asking you, how often do you want us to back up our messages and your messages? And what that does is it stores an unencrypted copy of your messages on Apple's or Google's servers, depending on what kind of phone you're using. So for users who rely on end-to-end encryption, that completely undermines that protection. Now those messages are sitting around unencrypted, available to Apple or Google, available to law enforcement requests and to leaks. So how backups are executed is a big question going forward.
Now, investors, Jitendra, have been waiting a long time to see how monetization would play out on Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp. Does this mean they're going to have to wait even longer?
On certain aspects, like she mentioned the complexities over here that they have to go through. Certain countries also have issues with it, with encryption. So those are the hurdles also they have to put forth. So we feel like this year and next year it's going to be focused on stories, which they can pull off within their current construct. But this idea of going after payments, going after e-commerce, that will require these issues to be resolved first. And so it's the timeline that we feel those aspects will take longer, but what's in their wheelhouse, which is stories, which is advertising, that they can execute on.
Now, given, Jenny, that Facebook has compromised user trust and privacy many, many times, and Facebook has admitted to this and apologized for it many, many times, can we trust that Facebook really will be more private if they make these changes, even though Facebook itself is still going to have this information?
I think time will tell. And you make a really good point that Facebook is still going to have access to this information. Even if all of your messages are end-to-end encrypted, Facebook can still see the metadata. That's who is talking to each other, when they're talking, even where they are. And that still tells a very detailed story. So to have all of those communications under one roof, under a roof that does not have a history of responsible stewardship of security and privacy features, that is definitely concerning.
Are you or EFF lobbying Facebook right now as they work through these changes, or do you have conversations ongoing with the company and employees about how they're going to implement this stuff?
We are always yelling at Facebook to do better by security and privacy. In particular right now, in a campaign called Fix It Already, we're asking specifically for different protections on WhatsApp and on Facebook about kind of user control and choice, about phone number privacy. You know, we don't have to look far to find evidence that phone numbers are not safe on Facebook, that they're not left where you put them. So Facebook has already kind of messed that up with two-factor authentication, another security feature, and it's very important that that is cleared up and that those safeguards are put in place before we can trust that Facebook is going to do the right thing with merged messengers.
And meantime, Jitendra, Facebook actually had a strong earnings report last quarter. What are we expecting this quarter, aside from a lot of questions from analysts about how all of this will work?
Yeah, pricing is going to be the biggest concern. So last quarter, you saw a lot of questions about pricing because as they transition to stories, the inventory opens up, the ad volume opens up, which helps them, but at a much lower pricing because they still have to prove the ROI to advertisers. Moving away from newsfeed is not a small thing. So this year is going to be a transition year, and we see risks in pricing continue to be the topic.
All right, Jitendra Rawal of Bloomberg Intelligence and Jenny Gebhardt of EFF. You'll have to keep us posted on your conversations with and yelling at Facebook. Still ahead, NASA is aiming to put astronauts back on the moon by 2024. How President Trump's 2020 budget request supports its lunar mission next. This is Bloomberg. NASA is speeding up its moon exploration. President Trump delivered his 2020 budget proposal to Congress Monday, requesting $21 billion for the agency to fund NASA's Moon to Mars program. The effort prioritizes lunar missions as the agency looks to transport humans back to the moon and eventually Mars. The private sector will be an important part of this exploration. Joining us to discuss, Space Angels CEO Chad Anderson. Space Angels is a network of angel investors focused exclusively on early-stage commercial space ventures. Chad, good to have you back. So is NASA right here to be focusing on the moon instead of Mars at this moment?
Well, so as you rightly mentioned, the budget's out and it really emphasizes the moon over everything else. I think that the administrator said very clearly that this is a stepping stone. So the moon is seen as a staging area. It's a place for us to test out the technology that we need to go to Mars. And that is still the horizon goal, but the moon is much closer. It allows us some big wins early on and allows us to develop the technology that we'll need to go to Mars eventually.
Is there anything in particular that we will learn from the moon itself, though, that we don't already know, as opposed to deep space exploration, which arguably, there's more to know?
What it allows us to test the technology that we're going to use to go to Mars. So as investors in this space economy, it's really important that NASA is going to be partnering with the private sector in a much bigger way. And that was the highlight of the announcement today. And so there's a number of companies that are working to put a lunar gateway in the orbit of the moon that's going to allow us to do a number of different things. One, it's going to help develop the launch sector that's going to go out farther beyond just low Earth orbit. It's going to allow us to develop the landing technology to go from orbit and to the surface. And in addition, there's a number of companies that are already working on technology that's being funded by CLIPS, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services Program, that's $2.5 billion over the next 10 years. That's funding a number of small and medium-sized landers that are going to go directly to the lunar surface. So what this allows us to do is really test out the landing technology and the technology that we need to sustain a presence around another planetary body. And in addition, the moon acts as a fantastic launch point to go out into deeper space missions. There's no, the gravity environment on the moon is much less, and so to be able to launch from the moon to deeper space is much easier.
Now, we often focus on SpaceX, which is working towards getting a human into space for the first time since NASA paused the space program. But what are these other smaller companies that are playing a critical role here that we need to know about?
Yeah, so there was $300 million set aside for the larger human landers. That's the type of thing that SpaceX and Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin are developing, these larger landers to take the humans. But to get started, this $2.5 billion that I mentioned earlier for the CLIPS program, that's going to smaller companies as well. So Astrobotic, which is showing on your screen, is a company that is privately funded, has been working with NASA and developing a relationship over a number of years, and is a key player in this CLIPS program that's going to allow them to allow NASA to deliver payloads to the moon for the first time in a very long time. And what this is going to be is to test the capability, but also to lay the initial infrastructure that's going to allow for a habitat on the surface of the moon, which looks very similar to, let's say, the space station that as it is today, with a rotating crew of people that are there on a sustained basis, and we have a continuous human presence there.
And the U.S. isn't the only one with eyes on the moon, of course. Israel, China, Russia all have their own plans. We're going to be charting all of this. Space Angel CEO Chad Anderson, thank you so much for stopping by. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. On tomorrow's show, I will be sitting down with former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair. He has been advocating for a second referendum on Brexit, and we will also get his take on the latest developments in the divorce process and his views on tech and emerging technology. Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter, of course. You can check us out at Technology. And be sure to follow our global breaking news network, TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg.